Hello, my name is Craig Grant, international speaker, instructor, and coach on all aspects of real estate technology, marketing, and cybersecurity, and also a certified ePro instructor and part of the ePro curriculum team. And I'm here to talk to you today about a very important topic, which is data security and privacy. And in fact, what I'm going to show you is now might be the perfect time, if you haven't done it in a while, to kind of sit down, spend a little bit of time, and review your current data privacy practices and maybe revamp them, because we're going to show you over the next few minutes that right now, really, cybersecurity and hacking and fraud is completely out of control. So, first of all, if you aren't aware of this, real estate is ranked one of the top 5 industries on the entire planet for targets of hackers and cyber fraud, because there's so many different kinds of scams that they can pull off in the real estate world, such as wire transfer fraud, rental listing scams, title theft, ransomware, and a whole lot more. So a lot of different kinds of scams can be done in real estate. And there's a lot of reasons why they're targeted, other than the fact that there's so much opportunity here. Well, first of all, if you don't know some of the data, scams targeting the real estate industry were reported to the FBI's IC3 division, which is where you report any kind of cyber crime. In 2017, 9,600 cases were reported to the FBI's IC3 division. That's an average over 26 per day. And these scams equaled over $1 billion in lost finances and transactions for consumers and realtors in 2017. So $1 billion in losses in 2017. But it's gotten way, way worse since then. First of all, wire transfer fraud doubled from 2018 to 2019. So wire transfer fraud is probably the most dangerous, damaging thing happening in the real estate world these days. And those cases are just exploding in frequency. And what I always say is it doesn't matter what size company you're in, what size market you work, what size the transaction. They really go after every aspect. A lot of times they even go after small transactions to stay underneath the FBI's radar. And all you got to do is pay attention to any industry news out of NAR, your state association, wherever you get your real estate news. They're constantly running stories about how the real estate industry is under attack with different kinds of scams and fraud. And again, it doesn't matter if it's NAR, your state association, Inman, everyone continuously is reporting about this. And like I just mentioned, it doesn't matter what size market you're in, what size company, or anything like that. They go after every level of agent teams and companies. And if you're not aware of this, there's even been several instances over the last year or so where realtor associations and MLSs have become major targets of hackers and fraud. So this is prevalent throughout the entire industry, and it's something you just got to be aware of and wake up to if you're not currently really focusing on your own cybersecurity practices. And if you're wondering, well, why are they targeting real estate so much? Well, first of all, let's look at it from the consumer side of things. When you talk about a typical real estate transaction, even a lower priced property is typically still a large sum of money. So you're talking about large one-time transactions that are also typically executed between two totally strange parties. In other words, typically the buyer and the seller don't know each other at all. They're usually complete strangers, which again, opens up a little bit more opportunity for a con artist to maybe act as that seller to the buyer or do something to deceive them. You also, on the consumer side, have a complete lack of knowledge or awareness of all the scams that are happening in the real estate world, especially with stuff like wire transfer fraud. And I guarantee you, if you speak to some of your clients about stuff like this, either they're not going to know at all what you're talking about, or they might say, oh yeah, I've heard about that, but they definitely don't think it could happen to them. They think it's a one-off case that it might just happen to a few people a year and don't know how prevalent this stuff really, really is. And also on the consumer side, you have a very high frequency of free email account usages. And free email accounts are typically used by con artists because they can just create new accounts every day to pull off new scams. And then you can't really trace it back or do anything to them if you're using a free account. And also, very low security typically is being done on the consumer side. Most consumers have poor virus protection. They really don't have the tools in place that a big company would. Because again, they're talking about individual consumers. So a lot of times they target real estate purely because the consumers have all these weaknesses. But also on the realtor side of things, the real estate professional, You also have some of the same issues, such as a decently high percent of the real estate world does use free email accounts. And the typical realtor I know has very poor security. In fact, a lot of times when I teach cybersecurity, it doesn't matter what size room it is, very few hands in the room ever go up when I ask, have any of you guys ever had any training on this? And when I start kind of going through different security practices, even less realtors have the proper security in place in different areas. So the typical realtor is not great as using free accounts, and they have low security themselves. Also, there is a complete lack of standardization in the real estate world when it comes to things like real estate transaction. And what I mean by that is you can even have two agents that work for the same company, and they could be using totally different sets of tools to log the information, like their own CRMs. They could be using different tools to do their contracts and forms and have their clients digitally sign them. A lot of different tools are used in each step of the process in the real estate world. So there's a complete lack of standardization, and every vendor you add into the mix is another opportunity for a hacker to target that product. And then even outside of the real estate transaction cycle, there's also a very heavy reliance in the real estate world on third-party vendor solutions. And some of them have good security and some don't. And that's the big problem is, as a business owner, you should be vetting every one of your software providers, your vendors, to make sure they have good security. But again, a typical realtor is using a lot of third-party tools and without doing much research or due diligence into that company's security. And what I'm saying here is the more cooks in the kitchen, the more hands in the cookie jar, the more opportunities, again, there is for a hacker or a fraudster to insert themselves or attack that product or service. So all of these are weaknesses on the realtor side. And then some additional weaknesses from a realtor side of things is also a complete lack of training in the cybersecurity world. As I mentioned, a lot of times when I teach this topic, and I'll ask an entire room, have any of you guys even had 10 minutes of training before today on cybersecurity? Only a couple hands go up, right? I have a big room. And that's a big problem. The real estate industry is really ignoring this topic to a high degree. And most realtors don't even think about cybersecurity until they have a major incident themselves, or maybe a coworker or friend has it and it scares them into reality, which is one reason why it's so awesome that day 2 of ePro now has such a big focus on cybersecurity, how to protect your business and your clients, and what to do if anything ever happens. So I was thrilled when they added cybersecurity into the ePro program because, again, typically this is a somewhat ignored topic around the industry. And then here's a biggie of why hackers go after the real estate world. It's not just the fact you're involved in big one-time transactions and they can do something like wire transfer fraud and make a lot of money in one click. But also at the same time, a typical realtor, is coming into contact with what's called personally identifiable information, or PII, on a very consistent basis. And I'm going to teach you in a moment what PII is. But one thing you've got to understand is PII legally has to be protected. Every state in the country has PII laws that define what PII is in that state. And then you as a business owner are legally required to protect that information. And in a nutshell, it's information that could really link to someone's identity to do damage. So you're legally required to protect it. And in the real estate world, you are typically collecting it or at least touching it at times on a consistent basis. And PII is extremely valuable, especially for sale on the dark web. They can take a record or two they can steal out of your database, go to the dark web, and sell it for thousands of dollars. And just think how much data you collect in the real estate world. Okay. And then when you start looking at, well, what's really happened this year in 2020? Since the pandemic started, we've seen a gigantic surge in even more cyber malicious activity. It was already out of control before the pandemic, but the pandemic has just kicked in a whole new area for hackers and fraudsters to do bad things. So to show you some scary statistics of what's happened since March. So first, the number of unsecured remote desktop machines. And what that means basically is a lot of times hackers will install a virus or malware into one computer remotely and then use that computer to do bad things across the internet. They're called bots. And that way you can't really trace it back to the hackers because they're using your computer to do damage to somebody else. Well, remote unsecured computer desktop machines rose over 40% since March. So huge growth there. Then you have what are called brute force attacks. That's when somebody just tries to hack into your website, hack into your server just by trying passwords over and over and over until they figure it out. Well, that grew over 400% just in March and April alone. So you're seeing a big uptick in different hacking techniques. Okay. And then scams have just been way out of control since the pandemic started because it's really opened up a whole new area for con artists to do different kinds of scams. And the people that do these kinds of scams are the lowest of the low. I mean, they look for just horrible opportunities. And right now, because of the pandemic, you have a lot of people out of work, a lot of people that are financially unstable and are kind of desperate. And when people get in situations like that, they became even more susceptible to different kinds of scams. So, for example, first of all, you're seeing a huge uptick in people working from home now or working remotely. Well, when you work from home, you typically have way less security and protection than you would if you go to your office and are on the company network with a good firewall and tools like that. So the typical person working from home immediately has poor security than they do in the workplace. You've also seen a gigantic upsurge or kick in internet usage in general. And again, the pandemic itself has created so many new ways for people to manipulate or dupe people. So, for example, email scams related to COVID-19 surged 667% in March alone. So, gigantic uptick in phishing email scams. Users are now 3 times more likely to click on a pandemic-related phishing scam than a non-pandemic phishing scam. So people are very susceptible right now to find out how can I get my CARES Act money and stuff like that. So gigantic surge in people clicking on links in COVID-related email messages. And a lot of them, again, are scams. You've also got billions. There's now over 5 billion new web pages that have hit the internet since March, all related to COVID-19. 5 billion web pages. And thousands of new coronavirus-related domain, like website addresses, are created every single day. And 90% of these COVID-related domains are scam websites. They're not legit. They're straight up scam, fake websites trying to dupe people. So a lot of fake, bad information out there that can also be malicious at the same time. And then we all know Zoom at this point. Zoom is kind of the pandemic darling, right? Everybody Zooms every day. It's even become a verb. Well, 530,000 Zoom accounts at the right as the pandemic started, they got hacked, and over half a million accounts were put up for sale on the dark web. That information. So they got hacked. That was part of the reason why Zoom got up to such a shaky start at the beginning, their security issues. But a lot of Zoom accounts were put up for sale on the dark web. And you saw over 2,000% increase in malicious files, like viruses being spread around the world with the word Zoom in those files. So 2,000% increase in attacks using Zoom as that Trojan horse. And then ransomware is a very common kind of a malicious malware where you click on a link and then it encrypts or locks you out of your device or out of your account. And it can even damage your network. And then they hold you ransom if you don't pay the money, which is usually done in Bitcoin because it's non-traceable. If you don't pay the money, they won't give you back something called a de-encryption key. And now you're locked out of your device forever. And it can really hurt your business. And just so you know, and this is another thing we teach in the pro class, paying a ransom does not guarantee they're going to give you the de-encryption key. They can still take your money and never hear from them again. Or you could pay the money and that could make them say, okay, now I know you're desperate. Now let's go for round 2 of a money request. Now let's increase it even more money. So paying the ransom does not guarantee you're going to get your device or data back. And COVID-19, since the pandemic started, ransomware has spiked between 72 and 105%. So again, a lot of people are clicking on links they shouldn't click on, and ransomware is a major contributor to what you shouldn't click on. Bad things could happen. So if you're wondering, well, how is this all happening? Even before the pandemic, 30,000 consumers and small businesses were the victim of digital crimes every day, 30,000 people a day. And now you're seeing even more increase in digital scams since the pandemic started. And if you're wondering, like, how are they getting away with this? And who's creating all these viruses and malware? Well, this is not a bunch of kids. The people that are creating viruses, that are creating malware and spreading them around the internet are not a bunch of kids. This is now the new generation of organized crime. So when we grew up with organized crime was essentially the mafia. And the way the mafia operated was very, very local intimidation and extortion. So they kind of bullied and intimidated their own backyard. But every mobster either ended up in jail or underground. And then organized crime syndicates from around the world caught on to the idea, why should we ever do this in our own backyards, even our own countries? We can sit wherever we live, create these viruses and malware, spread them all over the globe, make billions of dollars, and have no risk getting caught. Because even if, let's say, our government figure out who created a virus, well, then we'd have to get a government in another country to cooperate with our government, and they typically do not do that, which is why certain countries are so well known for hackers. It's because their governments harbor them and protect them, and they don't cooperate with other governments. So this is big, big business, well organized, highly funded. In fact, sometimes it's even government entities that are creating and spreading the viruses because they know there's billions of dollars to be made and no risk of getting caught. So again, this is not kids. This is big business now. And if you really want to know how they're getting away with all this, I've already mentioned the word dark web. I said they can sell your information on the dark web. Well, if you know what the dark web is, you hear it a lot of times in movies and TV shows, and it sounds like some made-up fake place. It's not. It's completely real. What the dark web is a totally separate internet. You cannot connect to the dark web using a regular web browser like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, whatever browser you use. You need a separate program called a torrent to log on to the dark web. And by the way, torrents are untraceable, which means you have no idea who's logging onto the dark web. Then everything that's paid for and purchased on the dark web uses some form of digital currency like Bitcoin, which is also untraceable. So you have no idea who's logging on, and there's no way to prove how they're paying for things, which is why you can really purchase anything horrible on Earth can be purchased on the dark web. Excuse me, including people, such as sex trafficking. You can buy weapons, drugs, people's identities, their login credentials, that PII, the person identifiable information, and a whole lot more. So you can buy anything you want on the dark web. So this is how drug cartels move their products and services. This is how ISIS and just every bad entity does their business on the dark web because there's almost no risk of getting caught. Everything's untraceable, and then it would be even harder to get a person, the government, to cooperate if we do figure out who they are and where they're located. So again, this is how they get away with everything. So this is all why, kind of give you a whole idea or landscape of just how bad the cyber world is these days. Why now is probably the best time ever, if you haven't done it in a while, to sit down and really go through your own data security policies and kind of not only do it, but you might even want to start initiating or installing some of the best practices. And if you're not aware of this, this is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission's 5-step process for proper cybersecurity. And this is something we really heavily walk you through in day 2 of ePro, is how to have better cybersecurity going through these 5 steps. But to kind of give you a quick little overview of what it is. So step 1 is taking stock. And what that means is you should, at some point, sit down and assess every aspect of your business and say, at any time, am I ever touching and collecting and storing that PII? Okay. So in other words, when you do a traditional residential transaction, are you doing it? If you do a government HUD deal, are you touching PII? If you do a rental property, are you touching it? So really look at your business and think from every angle, am I ever touching or coming in contact with PII? So first of all, if you don't know what PII is, okay, every state in the country, again, has different PII laws, but typically most states kind of, in general, kind of factor these things. If you have a person's name, which is either their first name or first initial, and the last name in the same location, such as the same database, the same program or whatever, as any of their financial account information, such as credit card numbers, check numbers with routing numbers on them, any financial account information that also has the code, you would have to secure that. Any private information, such as people's birth dates, employment histories, and things along those lines, needs to be protected. Any health information, especially that falls under HIPAA rules, definitely needs to be protected. And then any government issued ID number or card. So just think, when you do your business, for example, are you ever collecting checks? Okay. It's not bad to collect a check, but if you are going to store that check, let's say make a photocopy of it, you'd be smart to go back with a black marker and go over the account and routing number, because that's the financial account information with their name. It's okay to collect someone's driver's license before you take them out for showings and everything. But if you are, again, black marker over the copy of the driver's license number, because it's a government issued ID number and card. So it's not bad to collect these things, but if you are, you have to protect or encrypt the information. And then another example of taking stock, okay, is you also should assess all of your security weaknesses. And again, in ePro, we kind of go through these things one by one and more in depth. But for example, are all your devices being protected with the best possible antivirus protection? And first of all, when I say all your devices, I mean that, okay? Your phones, your tablets need to have antivirus protection just like your computers do. And anyone who owns a Mac computer has been told by the geniuses at the Apple Store, you don't need antiviruses on a Mac, are wrong. Every device needs the best antivirus protection. So these are the three we typically recommend, either AVG, Avast, or Malwarebytes. Pick one, make sure you install it on all your devices, okay? But that's another example of taking stock, going through your weaknesses and making sure you are addressing your weaknesses. Another technique or thing you should assess while you're taking stock is, do you have the proper password policies in place? In other words, does every account you have a totally unique and complex password? And when I say unique and complex, first of all, every site and account you have should have a different password than the next site. And by complex, I mean a crazy mixture of letters and numbers and uppercases and lowercases and maybe even symbols when they're allowed in a totally nonsensical order. Not a phrase that's too easy for somebody to figure out and hack, but nonsensical. And the reason for that is, if you have a simple password like a word, using a password cracker, a tool hackers use, it can take them minutes to find your password if it's just a word or a phrase. By adding just a number to it, it only increases to a day and a half. By adding a symbol into it, like Aquarius with an S as a dollar sign, now we're up to over 19 years. And if you make it completely randomized with, the 5, 7 and the dollar sign and the 3 in there, now we're up to 17.4 million years. So completely weird randomized passwords is what really, really works. So you got to have a technique of how you're going to do this on every single site. And that's the kind of tricks we teach you, again, in ePro. But you need to make sure you're taking stock and having proper passwords. You also need to make sure that everything running on your devices is up to date and patched at all times. In other words, is your operating system up to date at all times? Is your software up to date? And also, how do you do these things and know it's legit? In other words, you need to know if you're updating Adobe Flash, it's really Adobe telling you to do that, not a pop-up, which potentially is a virus. Okay. Again, these are the kinds of things we teach you how to do in ePro. But this is what you probably need to do, is go through and make sure that you have practices in place to make sure everything's up to date and patched at all times. And then another thing you might want to factor into your potential weaknesses in your take stock is, do you understand how phishing works? Because it's a very typical technique they do. And what are the common phishing scams and techniques that are out there? For things like listing scams, wire transfer fraud, a lot of scams happen in messages. It's called phishing or smishing if it's in a text message. But do you understand how to recognize a real or a fake message? And what are you doing to protect you and your clients from these different scams that are out there? All right, step 2 of our 5-step process is now we got to scale down. And what I mean by scale down is, if you are collecting PII, that personal information you're legally required to protect, well, maybe you could collect less of it, right? There might be certain situations because I don't really need this information. Or could you maybe completely get it off your plate and maybe ask a trusted vendor to collect the data for you? Now, it might be at a cost. Some vendors might say, we'll do your background checks for you for a fee. But if you are not doing the data collection, again, now you are safer. So scaling down, could I either take less or could I get it completely off my plate and make a vendor do it for me instead. Another example of scaling down is we just went through those potential weaknesses in your business, right? Well, you could also go through and make sure you have something in place to address each one of your weaknesses. The more weaknesses you solve, the less openings or potential security holes you have. And again, in ePro, we give you a lot of here's a problem, here's a solution to go home and implement. Step number 3 of our 5-step process is locking things up. So in other words, if you are collecting information, again, you're legally required to protect it. And what we mean by protecting it is you need to encrypt information. So if it's a digital file, encrypting it would mean you're either password protected or encoding something to keep an unauthorized party out. So you need to make sure you're encrypting important customer data information, such as customer folders, contracts, forms, anything like that has PI on it. Got to make sure you're encrypting it, which again, we teach you how to do. And if you are relying on third-party vendors to collect and store information for you, you need to make sure you're checking into them is what is their processes involved to protect your data. Are they properly encrypting information and protecting it? So locking it up is highly, highly important. And then step number 4 is, are you properly pitching the information? So in other words, yes, you are legally required to collect and store information, but you can't keep it forever. Every state has different laws saying how long you can store information. So you might want to look into your specific state's rules for this. But if it says you have to destroy information, let's say at a 5-year mark, then you need to destroy. Now, if it's a physical document, let's say like printed paper, like files and folders in your cabinets, that's pretty simple. You either shred or burn those documents at that defined period of time. But when it's a digital document, it's a little bit trickier than that because a lot of people think deleting is really getting rid of a file. And one of the things we teach you in ePro is it's not really getting rid of a file. A file can always be restored or brought back to life after it's been deleted until a drive is completely wiped of data. So not only do we teach you about that, we teach you how to properly wipe data because, again, you don't want to just leave something on a drive and let's say donate it or resell it to somebody else because somebody else can take that drive. They can bring everything back to life. They can restore your information and now have all that PI that was in that drive. So got to get rid of and destroy at some point defined by your state laws. And then step 5 is planning ahead. And what we mean by this is, and it's really the overall goal of day 2 of ePro, is by the end of it, we hope we educate you enough where you're able to create what's called a data or cybersecurity policy manual. In other words, you're going to have a manual built out that tells you if you ever get into a situation like this, where you have a data breach, you're under ransomware attack or a DDoS attack or whatever it is, what would your next step be? Are you going to have someone on your team responsible for PR, someone else doing the security, someone else dealing with the legal? What is your plan? And that way, if you're in the middle of a disaster, you're not having to figure it out right then. You're already going to be under enough stress. If you have a plan in place, it'll make it much, much easier for you to hopefully get through that thing and get back to business earlier. But if you don't have a plan, you're going to be really behind the 8 ball. So again, that's a big part of ePro Day 2 is helping you understand, have a plan, not just the policy manual, but also do you have the proper insurance in place, which most realtors don't have, that would help you in a situation like this. Okay, so it's all part of the big equation working together. So hopefully you enjoyed this session. And again, to me, there's no better time than now to reassess your cybersecurity policies and what you're doing in your daily life. Because as I've shown you, real estate was always a major target of the hackers and the fraudsters. But since the pandemic started, it's ramped up even more. So if you haven't done it in a while, please be sure to go through your cybersecurity measures and kind of kick in what you need to do. And it might even be a good time if you haven't taken ePro in a while to take it again. Because again, day 2 of ePro now really goes much more in depth than I'm doing here. Once again, my name is Craig Grant, cybersecurity and ePro instructor. Hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to get a hold of me. Or if you're interested in having ePro come to your town, of course, contact your local association or event planner, and they can bring me or one of our other great ePro instructors in. Thank you so much.